There's a number out there that's so huge that it doesn't sound real. $6 million. But it is real. It's roughly the total amount of wealth that's now held by just a couple hundred billionaires in America. And these people launch rockets, buy islands.
Oracle CEO and billionaire Larry Ellison just bought the island of Lanai, which is the 6th largest island in Hawaii.
Run surveillance empires.
I feel like that Antichrist would maybe be using the tools that you were building, right?
There are all these different scenarios. I obviously don't think that that's what I'm doing.
And advance at a speed that entire governments can't keep up with.
Do you know who Palantir is?
I do.
And they're sold to us as geniuses, saviors, visionaries.
You're Elon Musk. I am? What an honor to meet you.
But there's a time within living memory that this billionaire world did not exist. Only 40 years ago, the richest men in America were expected to shut up, be humble, pay taxes, and maybe put their name on the wing at a hospital. If that. Society wasn't generally that interested in ultra-wealthy people. Because back then, the vast majority of Americans weren't dreaming about millions and billions of dollars. Back then, the dream was stability. A good job, a nice house, a future you could count on. But then a once-in-a-generation handful of geniuses built unimaginably amazing technology, and they got rewarded with previously unimaginable amounts of money.
Ellison's fortune soared, lifting his total fortune to $393 billion US.
But it's not really quite that simple at all. Because they aren't just the richest men on Earth, they're also the most hated.
Mr. Zuckerberg, you and the companies before us, you have blood on your hands.
Today, people in my generation and others feel like they're more likely to destroy the world than to save it. And while some people worship them, others want to them.
Mr. Teal, do you have any comments about Palantir's surveillance of the American people, sir?
And so the mask is off. Billionaires didn't build the future, they designed our downfall. Because at the same time as these massive fortunes grew and took over our public consciousness, the dream of an affordable, comfortable, middle-class life began to die. And so the real question isn't, how did these guys get so rich? It's, how did all of this become possible in the first place? Who's paying the price for it? And what did we give up in exchange to get here? Not long ago, being a billionaire was far less common than it is today, and it certainly didn't carry the same social, cultural, or political weight that it does right now. The Forbes 400 is a list of the 400 richest Americans. They've been publishing this list every year since 1982. And for the most part, when they first started this list, it was basically just a bunch of people who had quietly made a fortune in oil, real estate, or media. 192 of the people on that list were from those three industries alone. This is right at the very start of the Silicon Valley tech boom. Steve Jobs, back then referred to as Stephen Jobs, was only 26 years old and had just recently released the Apple II computer, and he just barely made the list. All in all though, there were less billionaires on the Forbes 400 40 years ago than there are right now in the state of Connecticut alone. That's how incredibly uncommon they were back then. But I think the strangest part of it all, though, is basically how the billionaires, or mostly millionaires actually, reacted to being on the list. It wasn't seen as like a cool thing that you earned. Because just 40 years ago, the very idea of making a list of all the richest people in America was basically considered tasteless and unnecessary. Looking at all this stuff is kind of like looking through a window into a forgotten world. It's unrecognizable. It's like, what happened? How did we get here? And in order to figure out what changed, we need to go all the way back to the late 1800s. Even as far back as the late 1800s, the rapidly increasing pace of industrialization was creating immense wealth. In the 1890s, Andrew Carnegie was by far the richest man in the world, having made the equivalent of around $7 billion in today's money after selling his company Carnegie Steel.
Andrew Carnegie, industrialist, philanthropist, and benefactor, was not only one of the pioneers in the rise of American industry, established the idea of social responsibility for men of wealth.
And while this was before the rise of mass media and social commentary, Andrew Carnegie himself actually wrote essays about how he viewed money that we can read right now. And The Gospel of Wealth, which he wrote in 1889, set the standard for how very extremely rich people should view their own fortunes in this new age of rapidly expanding capitalism. In the essay, he talks about the biggest problem of his age being the proper administration of wealth, discussing how the most important part of being rich is to use the money to create things that benefit the entire world, and not just himself. He ends the essay with a famous line: "The man who dies rich dies disgraced. Carnegie would go on to give away about 90% of his money during the last 30 years of his life. He paid for the building of over 2,500 public libraries around the world, and he also helped Booker T. Washington create the National Negro Business League. In addition to that, he helped provide funding for Tuskegee University in Alabama, he co-founded Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, he paid for Carnegie Hall in New York City. John D. Rockefeller is another famous example of an ultra-wealthy capitalist in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Rockefeller founded the Standard Oil Company, which by 1900 controlled 90% of America's oil production. In the 1910s, while oil and gas were becoming increasingly important commodities, his personal wealth came to be about equivalent to 3% of the entire GDP of America, and he became America's first billionaire. Upon retiring, though, he also spent the rest of his life giving his money away. John Rockefeller founded the University of Chicago, and despite controversy, also supported a number of black colleges and churches in the South that were still struggling after the Civil War. Cornelius Vanderbilt, another 1800s capitalist, built a massive fortune in railroads and shipping, and he had a similar story. After retiring, he would repeatedly give some of the largest charitable donations that had ever been given in American history up to that point. But at the same time, the part I didn't mention is that when it came to their legacy, these businessmen's charitable contributions are footnotes compared to how they treated the workers who built their empires. Carnegie built libraries and schools around the country, but he also presided over the 1892 Homestead Strike. When his steelworkers protested a wage cut in the summer of that year, his plant manager Henry Clay Frick hired 300 armed guards to break the union, resulting in a days-long gun battle that left 10 of his steelworkers dead. Both John D. Rockefeller and Vanderbilt have similar stories of deadly work, poor pay, and extreme, ruthless control over their industries. During their lives, they were called robber barons, a translation of the German term Raubritter that referred to medieval feudal lords in Germany who forcibly charged tolls on travelers and merchants passing through their land. Essentially, they were seen as rich people who got that way by stealing from the poor. And from the 1880s to the 1900s, critics would commonly point out that people like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Vanderbilt weren't really creators of wealth, but in fact were robber barons. They robbed the public by creating monopolies that crushed competition and allowed them to charge any price they wanted. They robbed their workers by paying starvation wages, subjecting them to deadly working conditions, and they were willing to massacre striking workers to break unions. Political commentary and satire at the time would often point out that this prevailing laissez-faire economic system, defined by the completely hands-off approach to business by the government, wasn't actually what it claimed to be. It was actually a sham that the robber barons used to justify their continued existence, because it allowed them to squash competition, all while they kept bribing politicians to allow the corruption to continue. Regardless of the fact, though, that Carnegie got his fortune from working people till they died, he and his peers did set a standard for how extremely wealthy people should act, to not be miserly, to recognize when you have enough money and to give the rest away. Although that gospel of wealth didn't actually solve any of the problems that people were facing at the time. It was really just a moralization of the reality that Carnegie and his friends had built extremely corrupt, dirty fortunes on top of starvation wages, dead workers, and political bribes. Because in the early 1900s, the US was still full of brutal inequality, and its political system had no idea how to manage it. And so by the time a new boom arrived a couple decades later, the robber barons had mostly gotten old and died, and many of their companies had been broken up. But the system that created them was very much still alive. At the start of the 1920s, even though the rest of the Western world had been destroyed by World War I, the United States was totally fine. And thus began the Roaring Twenties. The same laissez-faire, free market, anything-goes philosophy that powered the Gilded Age before returned the aftermath of the war into the most frenzied moment of growth in American history. After World War I, American consumerism went into overdrive. The same factories that had been churning out weapons and uniforms for the war could now make consumer goods easier, cheaper, and faster than ever before.
This slipper is made of the new imported summer shantung embroidered in pastel colors.
They suddenly pivoted to cars, refrigerators, radios, furniture, clothes. In 1920, around 60,000 American households had their own radio. By 1928, though, that number would be over 10 million.
We shall now broadcast the election return. We'd appreciate it if anyone hearing this broadcast would communicate with us, as we are very anxious to know how far the broadcast is reaching and how it is being received.
Suddenly, there was this sense that everyone, not just the ultra-rich, could buy their way into a modern life. And another huge part of that wasn't just all these new factories, but now consumer debt as well. Buying a car or a radio or new furniture on installment plans stopped being something that only desperate people would do, and it became totally normal middle-class behavior. Borrow now, pay later, enjoy the future today. And a great number of people did actually begin to thrive. The average American income went up by over 35% as the 1920s wore on. And fundamentally, this was the beginning of modern America as we know it today. The 1920s even marked a fundamental cultural shift. Women gained the right to vote, youth culture became more prominent than ever, movies and radio gave rise to mass media and celebrity culture, nightclubs and jazz concerts boomed. In the Roaring 20s, even the Dow Jones began growing rapidly with no sign of stopping. And it was because the 1920s was also the birthplace of retail investing as we know it as well. With all these new popular consumer goods, there were big corporations making a lot of money, and all these regular people with more disposable income than ever wanted a piece of the pie.
From Boston to San Francisco, the market is the national media, the biggest news of the day, every day, coast to coast. And what quotation? Steel up, utilities up, buy on margin. Brokers' loans are available. All you have to do is have 5 cents for a telephone call, and you can even get that on credit. Just buy on margin.
By the late 1920s, over 10% of US households held stocks, which was totally insane and had never happened before. For the first time, business leaders and stock traders became pop culture icons. In big cities, crowds would gather in coffee shops and hotel lobbies to cheer on their favorite company's stock price. And so if you weren't convinced that the 1920s were just like today before, you probably should be by now. But a big part of why any of this was possible was because of margin loans.
300 million shares are being carried on margin. Brokers' loans are at an all-time high. September 1929, soaring out into the wild blue yonder, stock hit what looks like a permanently high plateau.
But history had other plans. In October of 1929, the entire American stock market lost 89% of its peak value in just a couple of days. Stocks had reached prices that were many multiple times higher than their earnings, with most stocks having quadrupled in value in just 4 years, a rate far higher than their actual growth. And so suddenly, it was all over.
Tremendous crowds which you see gathered outside the stock exchange are due to the greatest crash in the history of New York Stock Exchange and market prices.
With all the unprecedented growth, it had been hard to see the forest through the trees. In reality, the American economy was completely unsustainable. Even though Americans were making more money than before, income inequality was rising faster than wages. By 1928, just 1% of the American population was earning 25% of all income in America. On top of that, many Americans were in a lot of debt, and when the stock market crashed, they were unable to continue paying it back. Within 1 year, the unemployment rate in the US was over 25%. About half the banks in America had gone out of business, and the financial crisis had spread to the UK, Germany, Canada, Chile, Italy, and many other countries around the world. The American landscape was quickly covered in hundreds of shantytowns and slums that were built to house the millions of people, around 2% of the entire population, that went homeless as the recession became a years-long depression, an era defined by financial and emotional trauma. It was a disaster. This was the worst financial crisis in the history of the world. America was suffering. But in the aftermath, the entire American ethos changed. Laissez-faire, anything-goes economics were clearly not going to work anymore, and so a new system was built to prevent that level of inequality from ever happening again. President FDR and his allies introduced the New Deal, a series of wide-ranging social, economic, and political reforms designed to reduce poverty, protect workers, and create a more equal economy for everybody.
Settled in the White House, the new president went to work. To do so, he created the famous alphabetical agencies of the New Deal. Their purpose? To fight the depression, to provide work and security. Soon the factories reopened. Unemployed men returned to their jobs.
Social Security was introduced in an attempt to prevent the child and elder poverty that was widespread at the time.
But we have tried to frame a law which will give some measure of protection to the average citizen and to his family against the loss of a job and against poverty-stricken old age.
And the New Deal was also responsible for the ending of child labor. Up until the late 1930s, around 1 out of every 5 children in America had a job. They also raised taxes for Americans in the highest bracket of income to 94%, and it would stay at 70% or higher for about 45 years. The ethos of this period in American history was pretty clear. In an era of rebuilding the world after economic disaster, the sacrifice would be shared, and no one would accumulate massive wealth unchecked. If you want the full PhD version of this big economic and political shift, there are hundreds of books about post-war economic policy, and I haven't read any of them. I'm not going to pretend to have a full understanding of the New Deal. I know it's controversial. Some people want to say it was a mistake, blah, blah, blah. But what I can say is that this was an era when life for the average American changed forever. Economists call the period that came after the Great Depression the Great Compression. The gap between the rich, the middle, and the poor was compressed to its lowest point in modern history. And the very real, measurable result of this Great Compression is that it was also the birth point of the American middle class as we know it. This moment in history, this moment after a horrible disaster and all the changes that needed to be made to prevent it, are exactly why people talk about boomers being able to buy houses for $5,000 and a rusty spoon. Compared to the middle of the 1920s, when the top 1% of America was making over 25% of all income in the country, by 1950, that number would be under 10%. You know how people say that boomers had the world in their hands and that they wasted it, or how they had all these advantages and an easy life, that they lived in a fantasy world? This is why. By the mid-1950s, a factory worker, a teacher, a bus driver, whatever it was, many different people at many income levels were all able to enjoy a higher standard of living than ever before. Whether it was owning a house or a car or planning for retirement or putting money away for their kids' education, all of this was often possible even on one income for the entire household. In 1940, around 40% of American households owned their own home. By 1970, that number would be over 65%. Life for the average American in general was unprecedentedly good. Education, medical technology, economic opportunity, almost every measure of personal or societal success was going up. In 1940, only 15% of young adults enrolled in college. By 1970, that number was over 40%, and college, often funded by the government, was cheaper than ever before. The average annual in-state tuition and fees for a public university in 1970, $394. $394. Is that even true? And so the middle class, in many ways, wasn't really the middle. This huge new socioeconomic group, in reality, their experience was defined by better living conditions than anyone at any point in history ever. Of course, though, this wasn't a perfect system at all either. The rise of the middle class was also accompanied by insane institutionalized racism, to the point where large parts of almost every single American city were intentionally bulldozed to destroy black neighborhoods. Both apartment buildings that my grandparents grew up in after coming to America no longer exist because they were knocked down to put in highways that ended up destroying like 3/4 of American cities. And that being, of course, among other insanely racist laws that were written to promote segregation even after it was illegalized. Is illegalized a word, actually? This is crazy. I think a lot of people, Gen Z, my age, do not know this, or maybe heard it one time in school and just forgot. But in most states in America, women couldn't get credit cards, bank accounts, or home loans until 1974. Homosexuality was legally considered a mental illness until 1973. On top of that, the world was insanely polluted. From the 1940s to the 60s, industrial cities like LA, Pittsburgh, and New York were covered in smog for years. In Pittsburgh in 1948, a cloud of smog containing toxic chemicals killed 20 people.
Settles down on the industrial town of Donora, Pennsylvania, and brings with it mysterious death. A local zinc plant suspected of emitting poison smoke is closed down. But an epidemic of pneumonia is feared in the wake of Donora's deadly plague of smog.
And this isn't in the US, but I did find this while researching the video, that in London in 1952, there was a cloud of toxic smog that covered the entire city and killed 10,000 people in 5 days. And this isn't like something that everyone knows. This is just considered kind of a normal consequence of life back then. Cleveland's Cuyahoga River was so polluted with industrial waste in the 1950s and 60s that it used to occasionally catch fire. It was a river that was so polluted that it would light itself on fire spontaneously. Of course, that's not even to mention the Vietnam War, where trust in the American government reached an all-time low after wealthy, well-connected young men were able to avoid the military draft, while millions of poor and minority kids were sent straight to the front line to experience hell on earth in the Southeast Asian jungle. But the general end result of this era was that from the 1940s up until the 1980s, life in middle-class America was pretty much great. It wasn't perfect at all, but at the very least, it was objectively decent for most people. Maybe you disagree with me, but you can't argue with the fact that it was a huge improvement over the world of starvation, deadly working conditions, child labor, widespread disease, and poverty that had come before. In 1959, Richard Nixon, who was vice president at the time, would brag during a visit to Soviet Moscow that any American factory worker could afford a house filled with modern conveniences. Being middle class became a badge of honor. It was a cultural identity, a statement of values. It was the American way for 99% of people, even those who it didn't apply to. Everyone wanted in. Upper class was seen as stuffy, pretentious, or disconnected. Lower class was even worse. Shows like The Brady Bunch and Leave It to Beaver, then The Cosby Show, Family Ties, Roseanne, then later Malcolm in the Middle. This kind of media and storytelling perpetuated the middle class as the unquestionable norm. In The Goonies, the classic movie from 1985, the whole story only starts because an evil real estate developer wants to bulldoze a working class neighborhood to build a golf course. You could be rich, but you couldn't be too proud of it. The celebrity entrepreneur was not really a thing the way it is now. It was the era of the quiet benefactor, someone who pays to have their name on the cancer wing at a hospital without any of the patients knowing who they were. I remember even as a kid in the late 2000s, there was this kind of joke that everyone was middle class as long as you weren't living in a homeless shelter or driving a Rolls Royce. People would just kind of try to identify as being normal. And so here we are, back to 1982 when Forbes first started publishing its list of the richest 400 Americans. And in the year's first list, America's richest man was Daniel Ludwig, who had made over $1 billion in the shipping industry without ever taking a public interview in his career. Point being though, this stuff simply was not a huge deal in the public consciousness, especially compared to today. I mean, imagine a world where the richest man in America is just this kind of unknown person where you could walk by him on the street and you wouldn't know who he was. Someone who doesn't even give comments to the press, let alone own a social media platform. It's completely foreign. But when you fast forward to 1990, the number of American billionaires had increased exponentially from 13 in 1980 to a total of 66 10 years later. That's a 5 times larger increase than the previous 50 years as a whole. Today, though, that number is over 800. That's 61 times higher than it was just 40 years ago. And in 1980, the 400 list total wealth was $92 billion. In 2021, it was $4,500 billion, again having multiplied by 50 times in 40 years. So what happened? Prior to the 1980s, computers obviously existed, but their utility was pretty limited. They were refrigerator-sized machines that sat locked away in the back rooms at banks, universities, airports, and military bases, doing payroll, designing missiles, running airline reservations, or doing calculations for physics experiments. Famously, the computers that guided the Apollo 11 to land on the moon were 100,000 times less powerful than an iPhone 6.
That module contains 512 cores over a half a mile of wire. And it performs the function of storing over 65,000 individual pieces of information.
But they weighed over 70 pounds and cost $1 million per unit to produce. The idea that you'd have one of these to use at home for homework was science fiction. Like, it's literally something from a cartoon. But all of that changed when Intel invented the microprocessor in the early 70s, suddenly making it possible to build super powerful computers that were cheap enough for everyday Americans and small enough to fit on a desk at home. And so a handful of companies started trying to turn the personal computer into an everyday object that everyone would want.
Using an Apple II is very easy. The only hard part is getting your kid away from it. You see, Apples are the leading computers in schools, so even though you want it to help you work at home, your kid will want to use it for his own homework. Of course, if all else fails, there's one last thing you can try. Get him an Apple of his own.
Apple, IBM, Microsoft, Intel, Oracle, these names that feel totally inevitable now were at the time being run by outsiders pushing a strange new idea: personal computers in every office, school, business, and home.
Well, we base our theory on the fact that we make personal computers that can be used irrespective of location. And the home just happens to be one of the locations that the computers are used in. So we foresee Apples being used in homes, but we also foresee them being used in businesses and education, and there's an Apple going up on the first space shuttle, as you may know, to control a biology experiment.
And as their companies started to grow exponentially throughout the 80s, these tech founders were not seen as industrial warlords the way that Carnegie and Rockefeller were. The wealth of oil, steel, railroads, and skyscrapers was dirty, heavy, and violent. Early tech founders and their products couldn't have been more different. We're talking about skinny 20-somethings with casual clothes and bad haircuts, promising a tech revolution that would bring about a brighter, better future for everybody.
Jobs was a perfect model of the new manager as coach, cheerleader, and nourisher of champions.
He's a maniac. He's a maniacal genius. His job is to stir up everything. He's a muckraker in the classic sense of the word. He will not leave anything alone. He will not allow inadequacy or compromise to exist.
It's a great machine. It's a step forward in terms of the way it uses graphics and the speed. This is a machine that a lot of people are going to be able to afford. That's a very, very useful machine.
They weren't framed as greedy. They were seen as visionaries, anti-establishment geniuses, hackers, misfits, nerds. And so with the rise of tech, the aesthetics of wealth changed completely. For all of history up until that point, money was kind of ugly. Now it was young, loud, and unpredictable. And for a lot of people, that was fascinating. And so by the end of the decade, there were dozens of new billionaires and multi-billion-dollar companies. IBM, Apple, Microsoft, Intel, Oracle, Compaq, and they were being led by these fascinating figures that were quickly achieving celebrity status like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Michael Dell, Larry Ellison. They were bringing the world into a fascinating new future. By 1995, the internet had gone from an extremely niche closed network for academia and military research to a public utility with tens of millions of users. And this new era would again give rise to a whole new wave of billionaires making even more money as they turned the entire world into websites. You could suddenly buy stuff on websites instead of at the mall, hang out in chat rooms with strangers from all over the world, play games online. It was messy yet fascinating, but overall it was growing rapidly. In 1997, Google Search was launched for the first time. Amazon went public in the same year as an online book retailer. eBay became popular as a website where you could auction off just about anything in the world. And this only created more and more billionaires. By 1999, the Forbes 400 list had 268 billionaires, about 30 times more than just 20 years earlier, with people like Jeff Bezos, Larry Page, and Sergey Brin being just a few examples of the massive fortunes that tech was generating in the late 90s. But I think that this tech and stock market boom was pretty much seen as good for everybody. One big thing that was downstream of all of this was the rise of yuppies. As young people filled cities in an attempt to chase these flashy new high-paying jobs that were created in finance and tech, a new sociological phenomenon was born. Tens of thousands of these college-educated young boomers flooded America's biggest cities to make a bunch of money in banking, finance, or tech, and happily spend it on a luxurious lifestyle full of cars, eating out, fancy new electronics, funny clothes. And while yes, yuppies were broadly made fun of in pop culture,
real regular by eating my brand. I'm a pseudo-intellectual kind of man. Wheeling and dealing and working away. I pushed all 6 buttons on the Xerox today. My job, you know it ain't bad. I got where I am because it's owned by my dad.
they did still represent the idea that a lot of people were benefiting from this new world. We had come a long way from working in a coal mine. When Apple went public, over 40 of its early employees became millionaires in a single day. After a relatively minor slowdown after the tech boom fell back in the early 2000s, it just kept growing. If the 1980s were the decade of computer hardware and the 90s were the decade of the internet, the 2000s would become the decade of social media. After the early success of MySpace and Friendster, websites like YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook arrived in rapid succession and quickly boomed into yet another brave new world of tech. And this early wave of social media platforms ushered in an unprecedented new format for social connectivity and community building. Keeping in contact with friends or family across any type of distance was suddenly simple and easy in a way that was previously unimaginable. Even our social lives were moving online. The internet was going from a weird little corner of dark nerdiness to a real public utility, changing the world in real time. And this period was defined by founders like Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey of Twitter, Reid Hoffman of LinkedIn, and the team behind YouTube, all creating massive fortunes out of thin air as their platforms took off. It was hit after hit after hit. Tech was progress was good, and if it made a couple extra billionaires along the way, why the hell not? And then the iPhone came out, and it put all of this in your pocket, right at your fingertips, all the time, forever. If there was ever a moment where technology felt like it had become indistinguishable from magic, this was it. People would wait for days outside Apple stores just to get a chance to buy these things.
This is one device. And we are calling
Apple is going to reinvent the phone.
But it would only be less than a year after the first iPhone was released and revolutionized the entire world with technology again that it all came crashing down. The Great Recession would become the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, and a lot of the American way of life got torn to shreds in the process. Between 2007 and 2010, over 10 million Americans lost their homes to foreclosure, and the median wealth of American households went down by 44% overall. College students that had graduated into the recession suffered wage penalties or unemployment that lasted for years or more. Many people couldn't afford to buy homes or start families, setting back major life milestones. The Great Recession was bleak enough that in the end, over 15,000 excess suicides were counted during the recession versus previous averages. The financial collapse was so bad that it killed people. And this wasn't just the mood of the era. It was a fact that by 2010, the annual income share of the top 1% of Americans reached 24% again, the same amount it had been in 1928, just before the Great Depression began. But while the middle class immediately and clearly suffered, big tech companies didn't really see any noticeable slowdown at all. Apple's stock, and that of every other tech company essentially, recovered from the downturn after just about a year before pushing on to new all-time highs. For the stock market, especially for technology, there were no real lasting consequences. And meanwhile, the traditional path, the safety they had come to expect, the opportunity provided by college, the stability provided by high-paying jobs and housing, it was no longer as reliable as it was before. And I think as this fabric that held our world together started fraying, as these guarantees that made life good started falling apart, instead of truly deeply questioning why it was happening, people started grabbing onto anything we could to avoid feeling powerless. I think this is truly the world that I was born into and the world that I know as an adult. The landscape of hustlers, entrepreneurs, people desperately trying to make it big by any means possible. In a world where you could do everything right, go to college, work hard, try to find stability, and still lose, it starts to make sense why people are chasing millions and billions. In a world where you sometimes have to work a second job or break your back to pay the bills, it makes a lot more sense to tell yourself that you're an ambitious go-getter building an empire than to just face the fact that the world is
is that I think we miss an opportunity to find these kids who have the entrepreneurial traits and to groom them or show them that being an entrepreneur is actually a cool thing.
In the early 2010s, The Wolf of Wall Street is another movie by Martin Scorsese that was meant to show the danger of greed, but ended up being widely interpreted as a blueprint by disaffected people. American Psycho acts out this very vicious, disturbing, yet ironic narrative that satirizes the emptiness of consumerism and greed, but it went on to grow a cult following of young guys who interpreted it in the complete opposite way. And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of billionaires themselves have become media franchises. This is no longer the world where Daniel Ludwig, the richest man in America, scoffs at the idea of a newspaper interview. Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, they have become cultural heroes with millions of followers. Millions of people aspirationally following their advice, their mindset, their lifestyle habits, trying to become a little more like their favorite billionaire. And I think entrepreneurs and social media influencers building their brands and making millions by selling this grind set as the secret to success, selling courses on how to get rich, making this blurred line where happiness is directly linked to how much money you can make. I think all of that is a direct result of these economic changes, because in parallel, the middle class has only shrunk further and further. Between 2008 and 2015, job growth was mainly found in high-skilled tech jobs like software engineering, finance, data analysis. Basically, if you wanted to make a decent amount of money, you had to go work for a big tech company. That's where the money has been. Finance, banking, technology. Otherwise, these low-wage jobs were abundant as well, but middle-class jobs have become harder and harder to find in the aftermath of the recession, and they don't pay very well anymore either. Wages from 2008 to 2015 were basically flat. They didn't change at all. Meanwhile, healthcare, college tuition, housing, all of that climbed rapidly. At the same time, the stock market just kept flying up at light speed. And of course, this led to people glorifying and worshiping entrepreneurship and grinding. Nowadays, being normal is for losers. I mean, in a way, it literally is. Being normal is an indication that you have lost, because it's no longer a good life to be a normal, average person. And so I think we have this deep-rooted worship of entrepreneurs now. I remember having these thoughts as a child. At the end of 2016, I wrote a paper for school called SpaceX's Interplanetary Transport System. And I wrote in this paper, Billionaire business magnate Elon Musk, with a net worth of $10 billion with his ownership of Tesla Motors, announced his company's formal plan to colonize Mars within the next few decades using a proposed SpaceX endeavor he dubbed the Interplanetary Transport System, bringing around 100 people per ship to Mars with journeys as short as 60 days, blah, 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 blah. I was a high school kid writing a paper about Elon Musk, looking up to this billionaire founder who was promising to bring about a new frontier for humanity with rockets and cars and flamethrowers. 15 years ago, Elon Musk got a cameo as himself in a literal superhero movie. That's how much people loved him and saw him as this bringer of the future and an innovator in the world.
Mr. Musk, how are you?
Congratulations on the promotion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Those Merlin engines are fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, good idea for an electric jet.
But anyway, besides the fact that Elon Musk's colony on Mars never ended up actually happening, what I thought was interesting is I noticed today, just 10 years later, he's worth about 50 times more than he was when I wrote that essay. His net worth is now listed as being about $500 billion. And that's pretty much true for almost every tech billionaire. In 2015, Jeff Bezos was worth about $35 billion. Today, he's past 250. Mark Zuckerberg is the exact same. Larry Ellison, Bill Gates, really all of them. But we don't see them as having done 10 times more than they did 10 years ago. Because at the same time as these founders have increased their wealth by 1,000% in 10 years, they're also no longer seen as emblematic of progress. We don't consider them visionaries of the future anymore. Instead, they've come to be seen as emblematic of greed, exploitation, abuse, alienation. They've become the people who broke the same systems that they had first promised to build. In 2018, the mask finally slipped when it was suddenly revealed that a little-known data firm in England had quietly harvested the personal information of tens of millions of Facebook users and turned it into a psychological weapon. All those dumb games people used to play on Facebook 10 years ago, quizzes about what kind of bread you are, Farmville, in reality, people's data was being logged and psychological profiles were being created. They figured out who you were, what you liked, what you hated, and most of all, how to make you click. They figured out how to appeal to the paranoid boomers, the anxious college kids, the disenfranchised, and the frantic at the same time. And they took this data and they sold it to people who wanted to win elections. Donald Trump's 2016 election, the Brexit referendum, huge events like that were partially made possible because of this new type of ad targeting and data scraping. And this confirmed beyond any doubt what had previously been a conspiracy, that social media platforms weren't just tools or fun websites, but they were actually surveillance machines that could record our every move, thought, and statement and sell that data to anyone looking to manipulate the public. And I think this was the moment where that dream of connecting the world, bringing the future to life, all that started to crack as tech billionaires suddenly looked less like quirky geniuses trying to innovate the future and more like robber barons of the information age, quietly running surveillance machines in the background, no matter what the greater cost might be to society, even if it turned out to be society itself. It was also around this time that Amazon became notorious for sweatshop-like conditions in the massive warehouses they were rapidly building around America. In 2013, it was revealed that Amazon warehouse workers were often forced to work in extreme heat, over 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the summer, where instead of running air conditioning, managers would arrange for paramedics and ambulances to park outside to treat anyone who fell ill while packing boxes. In the mid-2010s, Larry Ellison from Oracle would also draw attention for buying 98% of the 6th largest island in Hawaii, becoming essentially a neo-feudal landlord with reports that lifelong residents were forced out of their own communities not long after.
Oracle CEO and billionaire Larry Ellison has just made a rather large investment or purchase. He's just bought the island of Lanai, which is the 6th largest island in Hawaii, for reportedly $500 million to $600 million.
Peter Thiel, who had founded PayPal in the early 2000s, began using the tech behind PayPal's fraud detection algorithms for widespread surveillance for policing and military use, creating systems that could track millions of Americans without their knowledge. More than ever, social media had begun to make us crazy. In 2021, a whistleblower from Facebook would leak massive amounts of Facebook's own internal research, in which they would admit that they knew that hateful, divisive, polarizing content gets the most engagement for their platform. They knew that their own system exploited the human brain's attraction to divisiveness, and they knew that their algorithms would learn to keep feeding people more and more of it. They had turned widespread social alienation, paranoia, and increased extremism into a business model. They had figured out how to find our darkest, most fearful instincts and then monetize all of it. These people were becoming the robber barons of our minds. Today, it's hard to argue that the average American isn't simply being left behind. In the last 40 or so years, education has become far more expensive. In 1982, the cost of a year at a public university was about 4% of the median family income. Today, it's 24%. The same goes for the price of housing. In 1982, the median price of a house was about 4 times the median household income. Today, it's over 5 times. In 1975, the top 1% of American earners were making about 9% of the national income. Today, that number is over 25%. They hold even more of the wealth. Over 30% of the country's money is held by the top 1% richest Americans. And the result of these changes is that path, that method, the American way, the middle class, it no longer works the way it used to. Normal life is completely unaffordable. The middle class, as we always have thought of it to be, no longer exists. In many ways, it's just gone. Suffocated to death by the reality that the core pillars of a stable life, housing, education, good wages, cheap healthcare, these things are becoming increasingly more difficult to find. In fact, for decades now, wages have stagnated while the cost of life necessities has gone up, forcing an entire generation of people to finance a normal life through mountains of debt. The American dream of upward mobility and eventual stability has been replaced with this reality of permanent financial scarcity, where even people with good degrees or jobs are just one emergency away from economic ruin. And there's an infinite amount of statistics about income and the economy that I could pull out of my ass to try and prove that. But I think culturally, we can feel this change as well. We're now more addicted to celebrity entrepreneurs than ever before. The Kardashian family, the Tate brothers, Mr. Beast, these are all these examples of this phenomenon of people who clearly, admittedly, do not embody virtue or the good life, but instead represent our collective desire to be rich because we come to subconsciously believe that getting rich is the only success or mark of virtue worth attaining. We follow entrepreneurs like they're philosophers, like making stacks of money isn't a means to an end, but the point of life in itself. Not again because we think they're good people, but because we've quietly accepted this underlying rule that they live by, that being rich and having attention is the only proof that you have lived life correctly. It's everywhere. Social media is full of people LARPing as CEOs or entrepreneurs, filming themselves like they're a character out of American Psycho, treating stock tips or crypto pump and dumps like it's ancient wisdom. If you scroll through Instagram Reels, you'll see countless people selling courses or digital marketing packages. Whatever it is, people want to be rich. We don't talk about being decent, being stable, being part of a community. We talk about building a brand. I think people my age are just totally brain fucked. The amount of people who have just started giving up on life because they don't think it's even worth it to try, it's overwhelming. It's like no one wants to be normal. You either want to be a quintillionaire who has 5,000 wives, drives a Bugatti and lives in Dubai, or you want to sit in a basement for the rest of your life and jerk off doing nothing. But I think the reason why we collectively buy into this idea of hustle culture and wealth is because we really have no other choice. This traditional vision of prosperity through modesty, it faded away. It's gone. We didn't even notice because our economic growth marched on infinitely, but only for the benefit of an increasingly small group of people. I don't blame people who feel pressured to be hustlers or to make more money or to be entrepreneurs because you have to. It's that or nothing. But I think the uncomfortable part of this conversation that makes it so much harder to talk about is that this same handful of oligarchs that are building up insane influence and wealth while the middle class drowns are also the same people who made modern life so insanely convenient and dropped innovation after innovation after innovation for the last 40 years. The list of accomplishments in the tech industry is endless. Google alone processes 16.5 billion searches every single day, instantly answering questions on any topic you could think of. And then 7.5 billion people, more than 85% of everyone in the world, have smartphones with unlimited access to news, entertainment, communications. There are millions of free lessons on coding, language, history, math, and science. It's all available on YouTube and other platforms for free. Even the barrier of language, the oldest divider of culture and nationality in human history, is disappearing. We literally have apps that translate speech in real time. You can go and talk to someone who speaks zero English and have a fluid conversation if you have AirPods. That alone could count as a civilizational milestone, and we take it for granted because we can get it for free whenever we want.
Mark, io mi chiedo, se le balene potessero parlare, cosa ci direbbero?
Mike, she wonders if whales could talk, what would they tell us?
They might ask, how do we solve linear equations?
potrebbero chiederci come risolviamo le equazioni lineari.
Sicuramente sì.
If I were born in 1969 instead of 1999, I simply would not have been able to spend my early career creating independent documentaries that reach millions of people speaking out against the rise of oligarchy in the US. It literally would not have been possible. And by the way, buying my merch makes it possible. So you can go to spiritworld.store to check out the holiday sale, and you can get free shipping on these amazing crew necks that depict some of the most intense corruption in American history. Either way, though, what I'm saying is that I'm using the oligarchs' platforms to speak out against them. I genuinely am more free to express myself however I want to anyone who wants to watch than any period in history till now. So the question really isn't, are tech companies pure evil and should we just shut it all off and go live in the woods? Because I think what we only realized recently at a societal level is what we're trading in return for all of this progress. And in my opinion, we're trading our souls. In the age of the robber barons, it was pretty easy to identify the give and take. They built railroads, oil refineries, steel mills, skyscrapers, maybe not what we think of as being technology today, but they were making the world bigger, better, and more modern. On the flip side though, they crushed human beings in the process. Thousands, tens of thousands died while working for them, but they did build the world as we know it today. It was terribly exploitative, abusive, and evil, but it was direct. Today's tech oligarchs, though, have created a far more abstract, but honestly, much more sinister dynamic. Tech workers are highly paid. Many of them become millionaires themselves, and it's seen as a pretty high status job. It's a lot different from laying tracks for a railroad in the middle of the mountains for 15 hours a day. And the tech products they create are often free, convenient, and useful. Instagram, WhatsApp, YouTube, Google Docs, Maps, Sheets, Translation, Facebook Marketplace, all this stuff is free. That's not how they make money. You can sell a car on Facebook Marketplace for $35,000 and you don't pay Facebook a dime. You can do your entire college degree on Google Suite and you don't pay anything. Whatever, it's free. You can do it whenever you want. You can have it's unlimited free GPS. All you need is a phone. What they make money from is selling our souls to the highest bidder. Sure, the old robber barons in the 1800s would work you to death and then shoot you in the face if you stopped. Today, they figured out how to get us to do it to ourselves. The dopamine loops, the algorithms engineered to get us addicted to toxic, negative content full of lies and falsehoods, it's all shaping our moods, our beliefs, our politics, and our identities to be more extreme than ever before. The robber baron has evolved. They no longer need to dominate the physical world. Instead, they can control the mental, cultural, and emotional sphere in a way that is arguably more insidious than just straight up shooting you in the back of the head. Our inner life, our attention, our values, our sadness, our happiness, our imagination, our sense of self, that's where tech companies are making money. They look at your search history, your interests, they build a map of who you are, and then they exploit you with advertisements and suggestions to keep us addicted to their platform, keep us spending money, keep us thinking negatively, so we just go back more. These products are free because we are what they make money from. Modern life is easier and smarter than ever, but for most people, it's also more stressful, more precarious, more unstable, and more mentally corrosive than it has been at any point in the last 50 years. But how could we have known? Almost no one looked at the first smartphones and said, yeah, obviously one day this is going to shatter the national psyche. No one saw Google in 1999 and said, yeah, this is going to become a tool to spread propaganda. Was there anyone who saw Facebook in 2006 and thought it would be anything but a way for young people to chat online? Because when the same structural changes that lead to these very problems we're facing right now were first proposed, they were actually widely loved by almost everybody. But why? For a lot of people living in the late 1970s, this mid-century era of shared prosperity was starting to feel like a messy failure. Interest rates were high, the stock market was pretty stagnant, inflation and unemployment were going up. Things weren't going amazingly well. By 1980, people were sick of government regulation. Society yearned for real, fast, rapid growth. So when Ronald Reagan showed up saying that he was ready to try a new system, he ended up steamrolling his way into the White House. In the 1980 presidential election, Reagan only lost 4 states, winning 490 electoral votes versus Jimmy Carter's 49. For his second term, he won even harder, receiving 525 electoral votes versus Walter Mondale's 13. Literally every single state voted for Reagan. It was the second most lopsided presidential election ever. So why do people blame what's happening now on him? Reagan's solution was simple. If you cut taxes on corporations and rich people, deregulate businesses and stocks, the benefits would trickle down to everyone else. On paper, it sounds at least possible. And so after he gets into office, within a few years, the top federal income tax rate goes from 70% to 25%. And at the time, it seemed to help. The GDP went up, unemployment went down, the stock market started ripping. But in the long run, I think we can clearly see what really happened. Yes, the economy got bigger, but the benefits for normal people just kept shrinking and shrinking. The trickle down actually went up.
Common sense told us that when you put a big tax on something, the people will produce less of it. So we cut the people's tax rates, and the people produced more than ever before. The economy bloomed like a plant that had been cut back and could now grow quicker and stronger.
And so now the world we live in is deeply extreme. Everyday life is a psychological battle. We're locked in this spiritual war to stay sane, while the massive, heavy systems of technology try to destroy our minds for profit. The people profiting from it have made their products so ubiquitous that it's impossible to even identify the issue at hand, let alone get away from it. At the same time, we're now living in a world where the stock market is totally divorced from reality, where the health, prosperity, and success of the majority of people has very little, if not nothing, to do with the strength of the economy as a whole. The GDP goes up, but the quality of life goes down. A tiny handful of companies and people essentially control the global markets. It's not to say that it's directly the tech companies' fault that middle-class America has shrunk, but it's that the same conditions that allowed them to grow so much are also the same ones that made life harder for normal people. Even the point I made about yuppies like 15 minutes ago has to be accompanied with a footnote that while yes, a bunch of people were making new money in tech and finance during the 90s, at the same time, normal middle-class industrial jobs got absolutely shattered. In the 80s, more factories closed than ever before. America lost 5 million manufacturing jobs in the 80s and 90s alone. So yeah, Reaganomics didn't feel like a cartoon villain plot at the time. If you were living through gas lines, double-digit inflation, the idea of cutting taxes and shrinking government, blah, 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 whatever, it sounded rational. And it did create growth, just maybe a little too much. The way that I see it right now, the battle has already been won. Or lost, I guess, for people like us who are normal and don't have billions of dollars. There's a very clear pattern of what's been happening to normal people. It isn't getting better. There are billionaire oligarchs steering the ship right now in every way. And in exchange for free, convenient tools and the ever-advancing promises of infinite new technology and infinite rising stocks, we gave up our privacy, our attention, our collective grip on reality, and our quality of life. That's the deal we're in right now. You get infinite entertainment as long as you're okay with a mind virus turning you into an obese, schizophrenic, libtard, rightoid, transgender, fascist Bitcoin miner. You may not get to own your own house. We're now at a point where the median age of a person buying a home in America is 59 years old versus 29, 30 years ago, but we have unlimited cheap access to as much porn, weed, entertainment, and fast food as we could possibly want. And it's crazy to me that pretty much everybody, no matter what side you're on, is starting to recognize that we are in a very sticky situation.
The basic things our parents enjoyed are increasingly out of reach for Gen Z and millennials. You see, the American dream has become a luxury item for the wealthy elites.
Concentrating wealth in the hands of a very small group of people, hyping the stock market like it's a casino, pretending that the party will never end, deregulating finance to make even more money. And all of this was followed in the past by suffering and even a world war after it fell apart. Afterwards, in our panic, we regulated everything, taxed the rich, broke up the monopolies, and spent 50 years pretending we had learned our lesson, only to forget and do the same thing all over again once we felt we needed more growth. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that billionaires stole everyone's money. That's not how a free market works, and the free market is what everyone wanted. I think what it comes down to is the idea that history happens in a loop or a cycle. I think it seems kind of obvious at this point that we've come so far from our past mistakes, but we've also basically forgotten about them entirely. People have repeated that phrase about weak men and hard times until it's literally a meme that means nothing because you've heard it a billion times. But I think what we're dealing with is an example of that pattern being exactly true. Hard times like the Great Depression, it created strong men who were willing to take action and make change to prevent it from happening again. And that brought about good times. But these good times created complacent people who ended up letting these conditions who originally caused these problems rise again. Boomer politicians, they made millions of dollars off the stock market. They don't care if tech is out of control and strangling the rest rest of the world to death? They don't give a shit. They have infinite money. Why do they care? They'll stay in office until they die. They'll be on the Senate floor voting while hooked up to a ventilator. They don't give a shit. And so I think the uncomfortable truth is a pretty simple one. Maybe it's not possible to have stock markets that go up forever and ever and ever, while a handful of people make trillions of dollars with tens of thousands of millionaire employees, while at the same time, we have a broad, stable middle class. Maybe we just have to accept that that's not really a realistic possibility. For the last 40 years, we've picked our poison, optimizing everything, taxes, laws, even media and culture for rising charts, rags to riches stories, making $1 billion overnight. And you can link this to everything. Why are people not having kids? Because we don't have enough money. Why do people have depression? Because we're not thriving. When you build a world where money is the only proof that you're a good or important person, you shouldn't be surprised when everything else starts to rot. The point of this whole story, robber barons, the Great Compression, Reaganomics, the tech boom, social media, hustle culture, COVID, the billionaire explosion. The point is that none of this is a law of nature. These conditions we live in, where the middle class has become a distant memory and tech is grinding our minds to dust, anything can be re-engineered. It's just that whether or not we do it before it's too late, that's out of my control. I mean, it might be too late already. The robber barons of 1900 stole our labor. The robber barons of 2025 stole our minds. And they already bought our data, our sanity, our attention. It all belongs to them. The only thing they can't buy is what we decide is worth worshiping. That's what they can't control. Our values, what we're willing to live or die for. At least for now, that part is still up to us. I'm Philip D'Amico. This has been Volksgeist. If you want to support this independently owned, not corporate, no AI channel, you can go to spiritworld.store and buy the most morbid YouTube merch ever made. I think you guys probably know what this is. That's spiritworld.store. These crewnecks are super high quality. We embroider them ourselves at home. They all come with free shipping. Very proud of the work we're doing right now, and hopefully you guys enjoy the videos. Anyway, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you soon.